Welcome back to part 2 of our delicious conversation with Scott Mackey. He is the author of Love Is Not the Answer, a fascinating novel that takes us on a journey to understand this division that we've been sold around politics. It's a playful yet profound and provocative look at the state of politics today. Scott has a background. He did serve in Washington. He's also been part of the green technology world, and now, of course, is an author and a speaker and travels to do that. In part 1 of the show, we talked about where he came from in the fact that he was brought up as an evangelical Christian, Republican, and his discomfort, we'll use that word, with all that, and how that brought about a lot of internal strife that put him into therapy at a young age and had him question himself, and had his parents do the same and created an evolution for them and for him. And then how that took him along the journey politically to getting involved not as a Republican, but actually as a Democrat, and following Obama and discovering what happened inside of the political machine and realizing a lot of things inside of that. And we were talking about, just at the end of part 1, in case you missed it, please go back and listen. I promise you there's a lot of good stuff in there. But as we're talking about at the end of part 1, Obama became kind of a new Jesus for Scott, in that there was somebody revealing something new, a way of a path forward that was more loving. And I was saying at the end of that, that in many ways, Donald Trump has become that for a lot of certainly young men, but certainly Republicans, in that he is this, quote, a breath of fresh air, this guy who's coming in from the outside, promising hope and change and something different. So I want to talk to you about this new, using my term, new messiah for politics in that Donald Trump, because this was not, as I said in the introduction to part 1, it was not the election the Democrats or the Republicans thought it was. I think it was something very different than that. Talk to us about this idea of a new evangelist, a new messiah for these people. From your point of view, how are you seeing it?
Absolutely. I would say that something that is equally true about Republicans, Democrats, independents, or otherwise, is that we often look externally to find a savior, quote unquote. We have been trained this way. The faiths that we often came from were part of training us or indoctrinating us in this way. We don't look within to heal or to grow or to solve problems. We look without for someone to do it for us. I, as a rabid Kool-Aid drinking 22-year-old in 2007 and 8, found that in Barack Obama. If we can elect this man, the sins of our past will be forgiven. Turns out it wasn't that simple. And I think that for a very different segment of society, for different reasons, in Donald Trump, they have found someone who respects them when they have felt disrespected or undervalued by popular society, and certainly by urban elites, quote unquote, for a long time. You find people who sense very accurately that our political systems are broken and are not working on their behalf. And an interesting thing that we've now seen for the last 3 presidential cycles is, 1, that it has switched between parties each time, and 2, that in each election, voters have been extremely fed up. They're convinced our political systems aren't working for them, and they're looking for change, and they're not finding that change in either party. And so they are switching back and forth. So I think that's a larger trend. But within that, you have this like rabid group of supporters who love Donald Trump. That's not breaking news. And they like that because they're respected. They like that because he thumbs his nose at all of these systems and institutions that they have just come to hate. I'm not a big fan of Donald Trump. But the man is a genius for understanding entertainment, for understanding how to build a relationship with people through a screen. And he truly understands in ways I don't really grasp, like effectively how to co-opt people. And I don't say co-opt people in a way where I'm accusing him of something that other politicians or folks aren't trying to do. He understands how in a very base way to accept the talking points, to understand the values and pain points of folks, and just like relentlessly and shamelessly go after that to win their loyalty. He does that incredibly well. And to like a population like ours, where so many of us are trained to look externally for someone to save us, some of us found that in Barack Obama and others have found that in Donald Trump, albeit for very different reasons.
But as you said, you came to a point when you were on the campaign and you realized that Barack Obama was pretty much the same as Hillary Clinton, just doing a better job of the same thing. And I think in many ways, those of us who are a little bit more politically neutral see that in Trump. He just plays the game way better than the others have. But then again, I still come back to this place of you talking about a political renaissance. So I still come to this place of, okay, can he do it? Like I said, Elon Musk and Vivek coming in to clean up the economy, clean up the overspending, the waste. Is that possible? Putting people in who used to run the World Wrestling Foundation, who's now going to do education.
Hey, our friends, the McMahons.
Okay, I love the fresh perspective. Is it the worthwhile fresh perspective? I don't know. I'm very interested to see where it goes. I will definitely say that. But it was pretty clear to me that the left was not going to win with what they were doing. And one of the great things about it for me is the left called Trump a celebrity president, and then they used every celebrity they possibly could and realized it didn't work. If you've got everybody from Bruce Springsteen to Beyonce saying, oh yeah, you got to vote, and it still didn't work, clearly it's not about celebrity. It was about talking to the people. So from a place of your messaging about love, where does all that fall?
That's a great question. There are aspects of what Donald Trump has run on that are absolutely right and universally true. Americans do not feel that government is working for us. Government is serving interests that are not the American people. He managed to leverage a version of that anger extremely effectively on his behalf. His thesis on what needs to be fixed, the way that he goes about it, largely elevating corporate titans of the very sort that I think have warped and broken our political system, I don't think is the way to accomplish what we might call reform of our broken electoral systems. So in that sense, I don't have a lot of hope that he will bring dynamic change. A couple maybe caveats to that. One is RFK Jr. inspires extremely strong opinions, for better or worse, leave it or take it. But like the idea that we need to make America healthy again, the idea that we eat extremely poor diets, the idea that the government is not looking out for us and working on our behalf as we allow corporations to market and to create food, is maybe very generous to call it food, actually. That certainly is not working. Absolutely. I love that RFK is going in with a hammer. People will get hurt in the process as systems break. But I also think that a lot of good can come out of that. And for better or worse, one way or the other, there's always going to be winners or losers when things change. I think from a government efficiency perspective, like no one who spent time in DC looks around government and says, oh yeah, there's no fat that can be trimmed here. It's just really hard to do. Reasonable professional individuals from either political party have refused to do it for a long time, to make the hard decisions, to step on the toes, to be unpopular. And now, for better or worse, we have two individuals who are, again, going in with hammers to weed out inefficiency. And a lot of folks will get hurt in that process, but the overall systems are not working. We innately feel that as a people. Steady your minds. Say your individuals have not chosen to do that coming from either political party over many, many years, decades we're looking at this point. And so now individuals who aren't so worried about being reasonable are going to do it their own way. And it's like a hard and a scary time. My hope is that for anything new to grow or be created, what came before has to break first, largely speaking. And so in that, there is opportunity here.
Enlightenment is a destructive process, even if it's political enlightenment. That's just the way it is. And again, this requires a level of independence. And you talked about RFK. Well, RFK was blocked by the Democratic Party, ended up running as an independent, and then because they were so afraid of him, they gave the election over to Trump. Today, RFK is still polling higher than Trump. If the Democrats had embraced him, but he was going to break the system running, even with his independent ideas. And I know that you got involved in this idea very recently of supporting somebody doing something independent with Dan Osborne. Talk to us about that, because that was a real life sort of meat and potatoes, feet on the ground, trying to make this into a reality. Talk to us about that and what your observations were.
Absolutely. So Love Is Not the Answer, the novel. I wrote that largely, well, first draft in 2022. So that was a long time ago, but it's about an independent political candidate that shakes up the system, causes the war on love, etc. So I've been really thinking and paying attention to this idea of how do we create space for independent or alternative voices within our duopoly, like our corporate duopoly, that is effectively just an enormous multi-billion dollar business. Extremely hard to do. So like looking at RFK, he took his own like independent swing. We can go down that rabbit hole if we want, but I'll avoid that for now. But the second half of this year, I was watching a Senate candidate in Nebraska named Dan Osborne. Dan, running as an independent, was doing great, was polling tied-ish for the lead. I was watching with interest because for a degree, I was like, oh man, like life is imitating art as it existed in my book. But I met Dan at a conference in September, spent an hour with him, was incredibly impressed by the guy. And I was like, called my wife after, babe, I don't know that either of us are going to like it this much, but I'm going to go on a working vacation to Nebraska for the next 6 weeks. And so I went up and joined the campaign and into the real world reality of what will it take and what could it look like to actually get an independent elected to federal office this year. And I guess, spoiler alert, we didn't win.
Right. So from that place, I had Dean Phillips on the show, who was running as a Democrat, and he didn't even get into the primaries, yet he was a strong candidate. Very bright man, good sense of humor, a successful businessman who was also a Democrat. You had Marianne Williamson also running. These people just got shoved to the side. You got RFK trying to run as a Democrat, made independent, shoved to the side. You've seen this with Dan Osborne. So got to ask you, Scott, do you see any hope of this reinvention that you're talking about, this renaissance? Or are you smoking a fat one and not sharing it with anybody else?
No, my medicine of choice are not fat ones, for better or worse.
I never.
The more mycelial, I think.
More mycelial, okay. Are you doing a hero dose and not telling anybody? Like, what's going on, dude?
I'll tell you this. I came away from my 6 weeks in Nebraska less optimistic around the idea of being able to create an independent movement that could break through the hold that the two-party system has on the American political psyche than I was before. And so Dan almost won. Nebraska is a state where Republican, like Donald Trump around 60%, a Republican Senate candidate is going to get around 60%. So that's an R plus 20 state. So he had this like enormous uphill climb to beat Republican Center. He had to basically get every Democratic vote in the state plus 1 out of 5 Republican voters. So would have been a miracle if he won. It really felt like he had a shot for a time. Then $15 million in attack ads got spent against him, largely just telling lies. That we can go into what those were or were not about issue-wise. It's the same playbook. But yeah, like he lost in the end. But being on the ground and spending a lot of time working in fields, like the grassroots element of the campaign, I ended up running that. Part of my independent curiosity in going up there was like, what does it feel like to be in the midst of an independent movement? For better or worse, what I did not find at all was an independent movement around Dan Osborne. Dan is a spectacular man. He was a labor leader who's worked his entire life, who led a large strike, who's a real Nebraska guy. So for voters from either political party who look and just say, our politics is broken, Dan resonated as someone who truly is from outside the system, didn't go to the right schools, hasn't had the high paying jobs, didn't have big money backers coming in behind him up front. Like he was really just doing the thing. But it wasn't an independent movement. There was no Democrat in the race. So Democrats almost by default were lining up behind him. And it was a very labor heavy state. There are a lot of Republican voting labor folks. And so he was able to pull a lot of votes out of there. Independents can win in this country, but not if a Republican or a Democrat is running in the race. If it's an independent against a Republican or a Democrat, great odds. If you have both political parties and you add an independent into it, I've lost, just like being part of the dynamic, hope that I was building has been a little bit deflated for me. But the flip side of that coin is coming out of the experience, oh yeah, the miracle is not on the verge of happening. But for me, that's really just a confirmation or a reminder that how important it is to work within the systems as they exist. And if one has values or a story or a narrative you're looking to promote or spread, which is certainly my case, that maybe less than building complete alternatives to the systems that hold all the power right now, the smart move might be to work within those systems to introduce alternative ideas and try to find a new platform for them instead of just starting from scratch.
But sorry, this sounds maybe harsh, but aren't you just saying, well, you can't beat them, join them?
I think what I'm saying is perhaps the revolution can come from within.
But can it come from within if the system is so corrupt? This is why I think that there was such an appeal in Donald Trump and people like Elon Musk and people getting behind this in ways that were very surprising to many people. The bottom line, you and I talked about this when we first spoke. We need to craft new stories and new narratives. And Trump was brilliant at that. He crafted stories superbly. You can think he's thicker than pig's poo in some things, but in that, he's brilliant. He's an absolute master at crafting those stories that people want to hear. So what are the new stories, the news narratives, and what stories and myths do we need to inform into American people's lives?
Yeah, you're right. And Donald Trump ran as a Republican, an outsider, a change agent, certainly not a traditional Republican, and ran within the Republican Party. And that's what RFK attempted to do. Democrats vociferously defended Joe Biden's ascent to again receiving the nomination this year and allowed no space for a primary or for independent voices within that. But again, they were allowed to do that because Democratic voters, the party as a whole, let them. And I hope that's a lesson that Democrats take away from this year, which is that independent voices and actual competition is a good thing, especially when you have an extremely old candidate who vowed to only serve one term. And so I hope my answer about independence wasn't too dark sounding. I will continue to call myself a political independent, but my reminder was that the duopoly exists. It's not about to disappear. It's also important to work within that system.
But again, I come to where I was at the end of part one, which is the system that built the Roman Empire is the system that collapsed the Roman Empire. The system that built the American Empire looks a lot like the system that will collapse the American Empire. If we look at this in a broader spectrum, in a global spectrum, we've got the US being the currency of oil. That's changing under BRICS. It's going to go to the yuan, which is the Chinese money. You've got China being a major competitor with America for sure. And yes, it's not as strong as it looks. And I get that. I read the economics around it as well. But at the same time, you've got a nuclear power in Russia who maybe are in a third year of the war that they thought was going to be 3 weeks. Okay. But they still hold more nuclear power than any other country on the planet. America is losing its seat at the table of power, certainly through BRICS and maybe through the idea of the American dream not being quite as transferable as we once thought it was to other nations and authoritarians rising in different places, whether those are authoritarian right, like Bolsonaro in Brazil, who became the tropical Trump, and you've got Lula, who took over from him, who's exactly the same, but on the left, right? It's an authoritarian left. We're seeing this in all kinds of crazy ways. And it seems like this globalist idea of how we're all going to play together. And I'm old enough to remember that there was this idea of we all sing Kumbaya together, and it's fallen apart at the seams. So it's an American problem, but it's a global problem. And I don't know that anybody is actually addressing it at the level of power. And so it takes, as you were saying, those of us to get in there and worm our way in and try and have influence. But in many ways, it's a worm against a bulldozer. You know what I mean? How are you going to stop this machine is really a very serious question. And maybe that answer is nebulous as love.
I hope it is as nebulous as love. And if that is the case, first of all, of course it's as nebulous as love, where love can and will be involved. Love is alive. It's alive in the form of spirit. It is alive in human relationships. It is part of all of our lives, one way or another, no matter how much we embrace it or recognize it. That aside, the global political environment that you described is undeniable. What I will call the failures of democracy and capitalism with a capital C to live up to the promises it has made over the last 3 or 4 decades is now leading to those systems imploding under its own weight across the world. And we are seeing instigators from the right and left who recognize anger, disappointment, broken promises, pain that exists in voting populations all over the world. And they are pushing for something different or something new, which has largely ended up looking like fascism. People see an opportunity to build a perfect brand, channel anger, and grab their own power. That's a very historically traditional route to leveraging popular angst. My hope, and I believe love is part of this, and this is something that we really have in common, is in the midst of democracy and capitalism's failing to live up to their promise, at a time when socialism, which does have, I think, great ideas in it, has never lived up to an institutional level of promise outside perhaps of homogenous Northern European societies. We are desperately in need of a new story, of new philosophies or new cohesive ideologies that can allow us to see ourselves individually and collectively as something different, that can see that we're capable of achieving in a different way. And so for me, love is a core part of that. Love is the power that calls us to the highest or the best version of ourself. But the second part of that I really focus in on, and at the risk of getting a little woo here, I know that you'll excuse me, Dove. I hope your listeners are as generous. But it's the idea of like, what does it mean to actually be loyal to life? And by being loyal to life, I'm really referring to the recognition that, one, we are living creatures in a living world. Literally everything around us is alive and everything is interconnected. The soil is alive. The plants that grow out of soil are alive. The animals that eat plants and bugs and live are alive. We are a galaxy within galaxies that are clearly alive, always evolving, always changing, responsive to universal laws that we give names like physics. We are living things in this enormous, sparkling, living panoply of life. And we like to view ourselves as these itty bitty little actors that are like, we are political actors within democracies, or we are economic actors within our capitalist world. And like what that's describing in the end is separation. And so what does it mean to begin thinking about life and to begin thinking about existence from the perspective of connection, being connected to all it means to be an emotional, spiritual, physical, and conscious human, to be connected to each other, community, the loneliness epidemic that you mentioned, to be connected to the natural world, this living environment that we are but one set of living creatures within, to be connected to spirit, whatever it is that you want to call God or a universal intelligence or the everything that is all. I think that we live at a time, I hope and pray we live at a time, Dove, where we are collectively ready for a new story that can integrate the spiritual, the physical, the personal, and the collective in a new way. From that gives us a new place to go, a new way to begin designing these systems of our future. I have a lot of ideas about that, very few answers, I suspect. But in this moment of what feels like crisis after crisis after crisis, it's looking at all of them and saying, oh, there's only one crisis. It's a crisis of separation, a separation from life. What can it mean to create or breed connection where separation exists? And if we can do that, how might that change our future?
It's interesting because I grew up in a politically and spiritually, psychologically in the 80s, 145 years ago. At least it feels that way. I can remember the coming down of the Berlin Wall. I remember that well. I remember the talks between Reagan and Gorbachev. And I also remember the New Age and that birth in the late 70s and talking about that out on a limb and the spiritual journey and all those kinds of things, the first channelers and et cetera, et cetera. And I'd already been reading Blavatsky and people from a century before. And here's the thing that I know as a student of history is that shit doesn't change until it gets too bad. And in many ways, the shit rises to the top. People talk about the cream rises to the top. No, the shit rises to the top first. And so we're seeing this, certainly on one side, on the left, this horrible talk of toxic masculinity, and on the other side, toxic masculinity, because it really is toxic, right? But with that toxic masculinity is being met by toxic femininity, which is just as destructive. And I think in many ways, as I love to be optimistic, I always will claim myself as an optimistic realist. I remain optimistic, but with very realistic lenses on, going, how bad does it have to get? COVID got the lockdowns and got bad enough that people went, oh, maybe we can question the medical system. Maybe we can question big pharma. Maybe we can question the governments. And in many ways, that was a great thing. Of course, it was devastating in its process, but that's what it is. The fall of the wall in East-West Germany did the same thing for the Soviet Union. But each of these things is always catalyzed by some massive trauma. And that happens for us individually. It happened for you at a very young age, at 8 years old. Most people don't get it. It happened for me at around the same age. My mother shipped me off to the rabbis because she thought my head was going to spin and I was going to start puking green stuff and talking to the folks like that. But it's that catalytic moment of this cannot remain as it is. And so what is your hope in people who go to the bookstore now and pick up Love Is Not the Answer and read that novel? What is your hope that they will walk away with?
I hope they're entertained. It is a novel afterwards. I hope that their assumptions about themselves, those that they agree with and our society as a whole, are challenged. And I hope that they are presented a worldview or a new narrative that they can begin to think about that might give them some hope of a way that they can effectively function within the world as it is right now, but without being as bought in to the us versus them, win at all cost mentality that infects almost all of the environments in which we live, all of the institutions we grasp on to find meaning from.
The tribal idea of othering is very alive and unfortunately a little too well. And we need to really understand that, as you talked about in the book and you talk about even in this conversation, is that we are all part of an ecosystem, whether you see that as a physical, mental, spiritual, or whatever system. We're all tied to one another in some way, shape, or form, and othering just doesn't work at all. So, Scott, as a final question, let me ask you, because you talked about your childhood and you talked about that kid and what he was going through, if you could bring that child forward to now, that 8-year-old, what would he say about how you are now, about who you became, what you became, how you became? What would he say to you now? How do you think he would feel about who you've become?
Some interesting phrasing, because I've spent a lot of time going back and talking to little me. But I think 8-year-old me, in a lot of ways, was like really uncertain if he would survive, if he could ever be happy. I don't think I really knew what it was like at that age to have a nervous system that was effectively regulated. So I think more than anything else, 8-year-old me would look at adult me right now and just have this enormous full body exhale of like, oh, it's gonna be okay. Older versions of me that were equally unhappy, call it in junior high or high school, who were like having ideas of how I would want to exist in the world or what it meant to like be cool or anything along those lines, would be very surprised at who I've become. But I hope and I trust very, very pleased, because I was super twisted up within myself, but I had really strong values around pursuing truth and really strong values around being of service within the world. And I've lived a wildly imperfect life, but I really have worked hard to pursue truth and to be of service.
I think we spend a lot of our time trying to make people, make the group approve of us and be proud of us. And one of the things I like to recommend to my clients is live your life so that your little self would be proud of you. So your little self would look at you and say, you're my hero. I want to be you when I grow up. That's how to live. Scott, it's been a pleasure and an honor, my friend. Thank you so much for being with us. Thanks for taking the time. And I want to make sure that people know how to find out more about you and about the book. So again, please tell people where they can find out more.
Beautiful. Thank you. The novel is called Love Is Not the Answer. The website is scottmackey.me. And I speak, I write, I have coaching clients, political consulting clients. I keep my fingers in a lot of cookie jars and try to, as you like to say, stay very curious.
Beautiful. Thanks for being with us. We really appreciate it. And for you, dear listener, remember, those who control the meaning for the tribe, which is exactly what we've been talking about here, also control the movement of that tribe. They control where that tribe is going. And leaders who are committed to positively shaping the political and business landscape know they've got to tap into what drives human behavior. And that is the emotional source code. I am Dov Barron. I show businesses, teams, leaders how to harness their emotional source code to move their tribe, because unified, actualized meaning is the single monolithic difference between mediocrity and greatness for all individuals and companies. Remember, we need your help in staying relevant, so please go to wherever it is that you tune into the show from and do us a favor. Rate, review, and subscribe to the show. It makes a big difference, and we really appreciate it. And for those of you who are regular listeners, thank you. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Till next time, stay curious, my friend. Stay curious about how you can maybe question the rules you're running and return to a place of love. What that actually means, instead of looking at somebody as another or separate from or in some category different than you. Try and find out what it is that you have in common, even at the surface level, but at a deeper level, remembering, as Scott's been talking so much about today, that we're all connected and that we have to find a way together, a way to come together to make the difference. And maybe the only way to do that is to do it from the inside, as Scott suggested. And that means finding a way to love and love the people who are offering the things that we don't love so much. I'm Dov Barron. I'm here to assist you tapping into your deepest meaning to reach that next level of clarity, focus, purpose, and profit in your business, in your life, and in your leadership impact. And I am out.